Welcome back to the Free Mind Podcast, where we explore topics in Western history, politics, philosophy, literature, and current events, with a laser focus on seeking the truth and an adventurous disregard for ideological and academic fashions. I'm Matt Burgess. This will be my last season as host of the Free Mind Podcast. It's been a great honor and a lot of fun to serve as faculty fellow for the past few years at the Benson Center at CU Boulder. But I have taken a new position as Assistant Professor of Economics and Presidential Fellow at the University of Wyoming, starting this fall 2024. Before leaving CU, I pre-recorded 5 episodes on the broad topic of the future of higher education. Over the past year, Americans have become aware of the profound challenges facing higher education, and I'm delighted to be able to bring you conversations with guests having diverse perspectives on these issues. First up is my conversation with Lesley Smith. Lesley Smith is Regent at Large of the University of Colorado system, and she is also the Democratic nominee for Colorado House District 49 in the upcoming 2024 election. Before becoming a regent, Dr. Smith worked for 30 years as a researcher and educator at CU Boulder's Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. She was elected to the Boulder Valley School Board in 2005 and served for 8 years. We discuss her career in education, research, and politics, as well as contemporary issues facing higher education. Lesley Smith, welcome to the Free Mind Podcast.
Thanks, Matt. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Yeah, well, I really wanted to have you on partly because you and Heidi Ganahl were early and frequent supporters of my polarization work. You're a Democrat, she's a Republican. Also, I think there's a lot of really interesting conversations happening about polarization, both on and off campus. And you have a really, really interesting background to be able to speak to many different facets of this. So I thought we'd start there. Tell us about your trajectory through research, through school boards, CU politics, and now state politics, and what motivated you to take the path that you've taken.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot lately because now I've run for 3 different positions. And, I knew I wanted to be a scientist ever since I was in 6th grade. I didn't really know what student government was when I was an undergrad at Santa Barbara. And here I am, hopefully going into the state house. So it just seems a little strange. But, in thinking about my pathway, what I've decided is I like to solve problems, and I step in when I see that I have the skill set to help solve a problem. And so, I was a scientist at CU doing research and teaching, and my kids were in elementary school. And at the time, we had school closures, and my children's school was closed in terms of the building, and we got moved into another school in a corner. And it was the most diverse school in the city of Boulder. And it really wasn't great for either school. So at that point, I stepped in and started talking to both principals and talking about what we might do. And my children were at a Montessori school, and Maria Montessori started Montessori schools for the workers in Italy. And so our school wasn't very diverse because we couldn't have busing, and we did not have any English as a second language programs. So that got me working actually with the administration for Boulder Valley, and we got our school moved. And at that point, Boulder Valley started this destratification task force. And that was to help even out the low socioeconomic status of some of these schools that had a very high percentage, even though the neighborhood wasn't like that. So that was my start. I asked to be on that task force. I did science education outreach, and I thought, wow, my director district seat is open. Maybe I should think about running for school board. So the way I do it is I make sure I talked to everyone, made sure I had the time available because I worked. My husband often was out of the country or out of the state for a month at a time. And I had my 2 smaller children. So decided to go ahead and step in and run. So I did that for 8 years. And when I finished, I thought, well, I'm just going to take some time out before I decide next steps. But the one thing I'd be interested to do for the city would be to be on the Water Resources Advisory Board because my background is water. And so I went ahead and applied. It was after the Great Flood. And the city council knew that I had the background, but also I had done a lot of outreach, both as a CU employee and being on the school board. And they knew because of the flood and hitting pretty much every part of town that there'd be a lot of outreach.
And just for our listeners who aren't in Boulder, the Great Flood, I believe, refers to a 2013 rainfall event that caused some creeks to flood, and large sections of the city of Boulder had their basements flooded and access issues and various other things, right?
Major damage, right?
Yeah.
Couldn't get across through town on Highway 36, the main ingress and egress. So I went ahead and did that for 5 years. And then I was planning on running for CU Regent for CD2. So for those people that don't know how the regions are set up, we were, the University of Colorado is the flagship university. It is in the state's constitution. So when the state became a state, CU also became the flagship university. It's written in the constitution that there would be 9 regents. And so we are elected by party, and there's a regent for each congressional district. So when I ran, there were 7 congressional districts and 2 at-large seats, so statewide. I was planning on running for CD2 2 years. So I ran in 2018. I was planning on running in 2020. And somebody
again, for those who don't know, that's the congressional district that includes Boulder City, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And the University of Colorado, Boulder. We have 4 campuses. So then somebody asked if I would run statewide, and I said, sure. So off I went, and that was quite an experience. And I love being a regent. It's been fantastic learning about all the different campuses. You know, I thought what I could bring to the table was I'm a research faculty as well as a teaching faculty, and there weren't any regents that had that background. So I decided that that would be a good addition to the board. Once I got on the board, actually, what has been a more important contribution is my extensive knowledge of policy governance, and I've helped get the board more focused on policy governance. So I was planning on running again last year, but we had this, again, related to water, horrific drought in fall 2022, and the Colorado River was running at record lows. We were afraid that there would not be enough flow to generate the turbines to produce the power in Southern California and so forth. And, you know, the legislature, I heard a legislator say, this is going to be a huge issue that we're going to have to deal with for a long time, and nobody knows much about it. And I thought, I actually do know a fair amount about water and policy related to water and water law, and started talking to people. And there was a lot of excitement because of my experience in water, my focus on climate change, and then also the full spectrum of public education from K-12 to higher ed. So I jumped in and I just won my primary by 72%, and I will be in the general election this November.
Congratulations. And I don't want to jinx it, but you will be running in CD2 in the general election, which for those of you who don't live in Colorado is one of the bluest congressional districts in America. And so I'm optimistic about your chances, shall we say.
They're pretty good. And I'm not running for, the congressional district. I'm running for the House district, but
sorry. Yes, you're right. Yeah.
It is in CD2. So
it is in CD2. Yes. Yeah. Now it's really interesting. And water is one of those issues that seems to me, at least, to cut across party lines, kind of like wildfire in the West. It's, fire threatens your house, water threatens your way of life in a or lack of water threatens your way of life in a pretty visceral way, it's hard for partisan politics to get too much in the way of that. Has that been your experience, or am I missing some non-Pollyannish nuance there?
No, that's completely. It's actually a conversation with a Republican senator from the San Luis Valley that really got me thinking about running, because I had been following the story about a development in Douglas County that wanted to essentially take a lot of the groundwater from the San Luis Valley for this development. And I knew that would be really detrimental to the farming there. And we were at a basketball game at a reception beforehand, and we started talking about water and farming. He's fourth generation farmer, has an engineering degree from School of Mines. And so we just started talking about water, and then it expanded to solar panels and lack of transmission lines. And I thought, oh boy, this is something that, I would be really willing to step in and work on. And then there's another representative from the Western Slope that's a Republican that we have talked a lot about water, because obviously our side of the divide, we get a lot of our water from the Western Slope, and they're pretty sensitive about that. So we've had a lot of conversations. So I could see very much working in a bipartisan way across the aisle regarding water issues in the state.
For our listeners who aren't from Colorado, the Front Range refers to the large urban corridor from Fort Collins down to Pueblo, where most of the people in Colorado live, on average bluer than the rest of the state. The Western Slope is the western part, west of the Continental Divide, mountains, ranches, and then there's the Eastern Plains, which is the other side, kind of towards Kansas and Nebraska, where there's a lot of farming. And like, I think basically every other state in the country, we have a urban-rural political divide where our rural areas tend to be very red and our urban areas tend to be very blue. Maybe with some, I think Colorado Springs and Pueblo maybe are slight exceptions to that sometimes. So let me ask you a broader question. We just talked about how water and wildfire, I think of the Western Wildfire Caucus that Joe Neguse, who's our Democratic congressman, and John Curtis, a Republican, now Senate candidate in Utah, run as two examples of nonpartisan issues. It's also my impression that the Mountain West is a relatively pragmatic, has a political culture that's a little bit more depolarized and pragmatic than the rest of the country. Not that it's not polarized. The National Governors Association this past year has been focused on reducing polarization. I believe the chair was Spencer Cox, Republican from Utah. The vice chair was Jared Polis, our Democratic governor in Colorado. I believe he's taking over now as the chair. And, you've got a Republican governor in Wyoming that talks about net zero and supports carbon capture and wind and nuclear, in addition, of course, to the fossil fuel industry, which is big up there. Am I right about that? And if so, what is it about the Mountain West that gives it that character?
Well, again, talking to farmers, and I went to the Colorado Water Congress last year, and farmers and ranchers, climate change, they don't talk about it necessarily in that way, but they know that aridification is happening. So the Southwest, the Mountain West, is getting drier, and that is definitely affecting their operations and their livelihoods. And so they are very aware that the environment is changing, and it affects their livelihoods and their businesses. So I think, it's like when Heidi and I banded together on the sustainability issue, right?
Yeah.
So we did not talk about that in terms of climate change, but we talked about it in terms of sustainability and how that ultimately can lead to stronger finances, because in the long run, if you make things more sustainable, you'll save money, right? So I think, finding those places where maybe we have a different phrase for it, but it's really the same thing. And if you can depolarize that phrase, you can work together. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
totally. Well, right. And it's not just the threat. If you're talking about environmental issues, it's not just the threats that we feel in the Mountain West. It's also the opportunities. We have great geology in Colorado and Wyoming for carbon capture, lots of wind in parts of both of those states.
And now geothermal, there's a
Geothermal,
big, huge
natural gas.
yeah.
If you believe in the transition fuel idea, tons of shale in all of those states, including Utah. So sun, lots of they're pretty sunny places. So yeah, and nuclear, of course, and minerals. I mean, nuclear. There isn't currently nuclear in Colorado. There used to be, but it's one of the options that's on the table. So that's really interesting. So let me ask you about polarization in America in general. I think I might have mentioned to you at some point that I'm working on a book called How Polarization Will Destroy Itself, which basically has an optimistic, not complacent, like we're going to need to help it along and we could help it along faster or slower. But my basic argument is that the core institutions of a liberal democracy, free speech, free and fair elections, rule of law, market competition, I argue they're probably going to be strong enough to significantly weaken the extremes on both sides in the long term, even without some kind of dramatic divine intervention. Although, of course, maintaining those institutions assiduously is very important for us to do, right? We shouldn't take for granted that those institutions exist. What's your take on the outlook of polarization? Do you feel optimistic? Do you feel pessimistic? Is there sort of a short-term, long-term difference? Obviously, this is a very polarizing election in a number of different ways.
Well, to be honest, I'm an optimist by nature. And, I feel like our state is doing some good things. And just given this last election, which I'll talk a little bit about in the primary, I think things are going to ramp down in terms of polarization. And I feel like on the national level, I don't have so much control. So, I read the one piece that you sent me, which has a lot of your ideas, right, for your book.
Yeah. Yep.
And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And I hope in the long run, nationally, you're right. So, just looking at our own primary elections, just, that happened last month, it's interesting to see that both on the very, very far left and the very, very far right, a lot of those people running in a primary did not get elected. And, so when I ran 6 years ago, a lot of people were running for the first time to be in the House or the Senate for our state House or our state legislature. And so I've known them, I talked to them and so forth. And the last 2 years were really hard. We know people.
The last 4 years were really hard in terms of, if you're talking about polarization, but economically, well, also I would say the last 4 years.
In our House, we had House members quit, right? Because they just found it too toxic and too polarized. And so a lot of people asked me, are you sure you want to be running for this position? And I said, yes. I'm hoping things will ramp down, and I think they will. And I'm optimistic that things won't be as polarized in our state House. And maybe we could be a model for, other states if we manage to get it tamped down and work in a way that we can get things done in the state. And I know, of course, we've got the triumvirate, right? We've got the governor, the House, and the Senate all blue. That helps. But, within the Democratic side, there was a pretty wide ranging from very far left to, I would say, moderate, right? And it was toxic.
So you've explained how polarization is toxic for people in the state House. One of the interesting dynamics, too, that I think relates to how polarized the state House is the balance of power, right? So if one party has a big victory, then what tends to happen is the other party is left only with their safest seats. And so disproportionately, it's going to be their moderate members that are losing to the moderates on the other, in this case, moderate Republicans losing to moderate Democrats in the last election. And so, that on its own is going to make the Republican caucus probably less moderate, and vice versa in another state where it's flipped. Yeah. But you talked about primaries, which is very interesting. And I haven't paid as close attention as you have to Colorado politics, but I've seen similar things nationally, right? It was not a foregone conclusion that Lauren Boebert was going to win her primary in the 4th. It was not a foregone conclusion that she was going to win the general when we thought she was going to run in the 3rd. Whatever you think about the veracity of this charge, it certainly was a sign that things have changed, at least to me, from 2020 to now, that Jamal Bowman lost in the Bronx a primary to a 70-year-old white guy who called him a racist, right? That would not have happened 4 years ago. Whether or not you think that that's a fair, that he was being fair. So what is it about the voters that you think is driving this? Because the voters, I imagine most are not following, how toxic the discourse in the state house is, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe primary voters are more engaged. But what is it about the voters that's making them take a different tack this time?
Well, actually, it's interesting because the universe of voters in the primaries, I was surprised at how much smaller it is than in the general. So, I think, the people that do vote in primaries are more clued in to what's going on. And interestingly enough, I don't know if since you said you haven't really followed the primary too much, a lot of money was spent by labor, business, and dark money. So we don't know who the donors were. And so it was really apparent that all of those groups were a lot of the groups were really trying to put the thumb on the scale and say, we want to get this House, be it on the Republican side or the Democrat side, more central. I don't know how much that has tipped the scale in this election. I've been reading all the articles that I've been able to read, and there's a lot of money that poured in, and there's probably some truth to that. And interestingly enough, I just read a headline today in the Washington Post saying that President Trump's pick for the VP has Republicans that are, in businesses and so forth, worried. So,
because he's a populist?
Yep. So, again, sort of thinking about sustainability and saving money, people get nervous, right? Like, how is this going to affect our economy? How is it going to affect businesses and so forth?
Yeah, and there can be an interesting dynamic there too, right? So in 2016, when former President Trump was running for his first election, my recollection is that a lot of the business community was pretty outwardly against him, partly because of his populism. And then when he came to power, he arguably made some pretty major policy concessions to the business community to kind of keep their support. And it's not hard to imagine a similar dynamic happening this time with, for example, Elon Musk just announced he's going to spend $45 million a month on a Trump-related PAC. But is he going to...
Don't get me into campaign finance.
Yeah, right. Is he going to get... Well, and one of the ideas that I'm exploring in this book is that although it probably does have a huge effect on any election where there's not a lot of name recognition, so local elections, my hypothesis about working hypothesis, I'm open to being wrong. My working hypothesis about high name recognition national elections is that money matters less than people think, because a TV ad isn't going to convince somebody to like Trump if they don't like Trump, or dislike Trump if they like Trump, probably. So let's talk a little bit about, well, actually, I'm going to turn to campuses, but before we turn to campuses, let me just ask you this, whether it's voters on their own, whether it's, the business community, whoever is pushing back against the forces of extremism, are they basically doing so? Like my theory is that they're doing so because the extremes were only ever popular to the extent that they were because they claim to be in service to higher ideals that we genuinely care about, and they're transparently failing at serving those ideals. And also, they're creating polarization itself and extremism is creating lots of bad, toxic externalities for society. Is that right, or am I missing something?
I can't say generally. Personally, my husband's German, and so we also watch a lot of what's going on in Germany and Europe.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I mean, France did not go the way that people were expecting, fortunately. But, I
wasn't surprised by that, actually, but I'll come down to that. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's sort of scary to see what's happening worldwide with populism and, Orban and the restrictions that are happening to the press and, potentially the legal system and so forth. So I look at things in a much broader sense, and the U.S. is sort of, all of this is moving towards that direction, and it's really scary, but I don't know how the average voter, if they put all these different pieces together or not. Does that make sense?
So quick aside. Yeah, it does. Quick aside about France. The reason I wasn't surprised about France is that I grew up in Quebec.
Yes.
And Quebec, has some obviously cultural differences from France, but also some similarities. And one of the cultural similarities, which is hard to understand in the rest of the English-speaking world, is the willingness to vote strategically in France and Quebec is like nothing I've seen anywhere else, right? So you, like Macron, I believe, had created a party out of thin air and then won the election, a few years later.
Right.
Similar thing has happened at least once in my lifetime in Quebec with the CAQ party. So that is the kind of thing that, people dropping out, people voting super strategically, massive swings in the polls in the short terms. That's, for me, that's very on brand for France and Quebec, but maybe not something you would see. There seems to be more kind of ingrained party loyalty here. Well, let me ask you a more important question about populism. So I think it's easy to look at populism, particularly, frankly, from an elite vantage point. You and I are both educated, PhDs, right? Fit most people's definition of elite. It's easy to find it scary because it's populism tends to be angry, right? It tends to be bent on change. It tends to be, anti-elite in some way or other, right? And sometimes it's associated with political movements that end up taking authoritarian turns. On the other hand, why do you think populism is such a potent force? Like are people not right to be pissed off at some level? And what do you think they're pissed off about? And what do you think they're right to be pissed off about, if anything?
Well, I can certainly understand. I think there's a large segment in the U.S. that's worried that we are, the makeup of our ethnicity is changing, right? At one point, we're going to be majority Hispanic or Latino, however you want to say it. I think that's worrisome for them because society is changing in a way that to them might be scary. They don't understand. They think it might be detrimental to their communities and so forth. I know you talked about the urban-rural divide, which tends to be red versus blue. In those red part of the countries, farming and ranching, they're worried about their way of life. If they can still continue, generations to come. And it's the blue areas, it's the big cities that are making all the decisions and perhaps not taking into account what those people out in the rural areas would want. I think a great example in Colorado is the reintroduction to wolves.
Yep.
Of wolves. And we've had cattle killed and so forth. And personally, myself, as being a scientist, I felt like that's something a wildlife biologist, people with expertise in that, they're the ones that should be deciding whether or not we should be reintroducing wolves. No one asked me, but that's just a prime example where, and that wasn't even the capital. That was the will of the people. They decided to get that
disconnect
right onto the ballot.
Yeah.
But it's city slickers probably that decided, oh, this would be a good idea, and let's get the signatures and let's vote on it, and it passed.
The disconnect between who basically voted for it and who's impacted by it, I think, is certainly, in my experience visiting the Western Slope for polarization related things and talking about this issue, is definitely part of the resentment, which frankly I understand, right? It's, it can be true that it makes sense that people are pissed off about, these people over here deciding something that makes my life harder over here. And it could also be true that there's a strong ecological case. There's a professor at CU who's a good friend of mine who's, led the campaign to reintroduce wolves, right? And she has a lot of ecological research that supports that position from an ecological standpoint, and those aren't mutually exclusive. One thing you pointed out, which is interesting and certainly is part of the story, right, is what you might call cultural anxiety, right, in terms of populism. And I don't want to minimize that. It's almost certainly part of the story. There's a book by a fellow Canadian academic named Eric Kaufman called White Shift, from the very beginning, like when Brexit was still news, right? That talks about this anxiety kind of in the terms that you did. But I think that it can't also be the whole story, and I don't think that you were saying that it was. But one of the things I think is really interesting about this moment politically is that former President Trump is polling higher than Republicans have in decades with non-white voters, right? So some polls have him at 20% of black voters and even higher black percentages of black male voters. Ron DeSantis, I believe, won the Hispanic vote in Florida in the last election, and Trump has gained in the polls among Hispanic voters. In fact, between 2016 and 2020, and if you look at the exit polls, the only race by sex demographic that Trump did worse in 2020 than 2016 was white men. So how do you explain that? Because that seems different from what you would predict if it was just the cultural resentment, cultural anxiety story.
Yes. And so it's interesting because we just had our board retreat last week. Whites aren't monolithic, browns aren't monolithic, blacks aren't monolithic, women,
100%, yeah,
so forth, right? So I can't really explain why certain groups are attracted to Trump, but I'm in terms of populism, I was obviously mainly talking about the white people in our country that are
sure
Trump's populist. I think they're worried, but I do think a lot of it is not feeling like there's any, like their voices are not being heard in the capitals, be it a state capital or a federal capital, and they're just angry that they don't feel like they're being heard or represented well. I think they are clinging to people like Trump that sort of go down to the populist base. Now, do they really do better for them? That would be my question.
Right. I mean, one of the things I asked in my piece is, is Trump really a good Christian, right? But let me ask kind of a bridging question. My next topic that I was going to get into was campus polarization, and I think actually a good topic to bridge these two topics is the diploma divide, right? Which is growing ever bigger in terms of educated people voting for the Democrats disproportionately, meaning college educated people without college degrees voting for the Republicans, and kind of. If I had to crudely summarize it, my summary of my sense from what I've read is basically, and just from talking to people, is that it comes from at least the last couple of decades of the median voter is a social conservative and a economic liberal. The educated people tend to think it's the opposite, but it's actually a tiny fraction of the country that's a economic conservative and social liberal, and they're disproportionately elites. Right. Then if you think about it it makes sense. If somebody says like, if you ask a working class person, what's more important, ensuring that people can work manufacturing jobs for a living wage or policing pronouns, it's obvious which of those two what they're going to pick, right? And my sense is that the populist reaction, which I think has happened both across parties, but also within both parties, especially I think the Republican Party, it's a backlash against kind of the establishment Republican model of trickle down economics, right? Why are business people afraid of J.D. Vance? It's probably not just that they think that he's Trumpy. It's also that he's willing to team up with Elizabeth Warren on, antitrust policy. I think was one example, and he's not afraid to go after big tech, under antitrust. And then on the left, it's the feeling that material concerns, historically the left has been the party of the working class, for several decades. And at some point, the feeling has become that material concerns among the Democrats were sidelined in favor of cultural concerns that, whatever your position on them, don't affect as many people in kind of a kitchen table way, right? So, take one example that I would argue probably both parties spend too much time talking about, whether or not trans women can compete in women's sports. And we don't have to get into the specifics of that topic, but just as an example, there's some culture war topics that, regardless of which side you take, you're not talking about that many people's lives being affected compared to inflation, compared to crime. Even things like crime and policing, the number of unarmed people killed by police before George Floyd was murdered is at least 2 orders of magnitude less than the number of extra murders that happened arguably in response to some of the lax policing and prosecuting policies that followed that. And frustrations about that, frustrations about the effects that the border crisis is having, whether or not whatever your moral positions are, there are a lot of people who are not allowed to work being bused to cities where they either have to be supported or be allowed to be destitute. Now, there's different solutions to that don't, not all of them require closing the border, right? You can let them work too, right? So there's kind of different ways you could solve that problem. But I guess, what's your response to my suggestion that populism is yes, in partly for some segments of white America is about anxiety, about demographics. Although even the demographic forecast is actually nuanced, right? So if the fastest growing segment of the non-white population that's projected to become a majority in 2060 or something is kids like mine, kids that are mixed. And because white adults are a majority, a plurality, if not a majority of mixed race kids have a white parent. And so, I don't know. I think to me, that's a really important nuance. Like, it's not, I think some people hear that statistic and get concerned and sort of imagine it's not like, we're shipping in a bunch of people, right? It's the, we have a diverse society and we have a diverse society that's thankfully not more segregated than it is, right? And that's the consequence that actually I think in the long term lowers the temperature, right? Like, does anybody talk about Italian and Irish immigration anymore with anxiety? No. So my hypothesis and my hope is that that's where we're going to end up with other types of immigration.
Back when those immigrants were coming in, there was a lot of backlash against them. Right?
100%. Yeah.
So, it's waves. And then eventually we get the melting pot, right?
Yeah. But what's your take on what's your response to my claim that populism is about more than just cultural anxiety? It's a large segment of our population, disproportionately those without college degrees, feel like their economic interests have been ignored and trivialized, ignored by the right and kind of trivialized and or sidelined by the left in favor of concerns that, in some cases are real. I'm not, going to minimize the racism or discrimination or sexism a real phenomenon, but in some cases, can look more like etiquette concerns than kind of substantive concerns. What's your response to that claim?
I'm hoping I understand what you're getting at. So there used to be, I think, such a push for graduate from high school and go to college, right? And now the pendulum is definitely swung, and I think in part because we have to, we don't have as many people going to college. We have less students even graduating from high school because our population growth is shrinking. So now there's a big emphasis on getting a certification, going to community college, for the trades, because, back in the day before I was even going to school, well, maybe when I was going to school, but I went to an all-girls school, so we didn't have shop. But, high schools all had a shop, right? And so people, and they were mainly for boys. Boys could go off and go to shop and continue on and go into the trades. And the high schools got rid of all that. And so the trend then swung to you need a college degree in order to get a well-paying job. And now I think we're realizing that we want people to get what they need in order to get the jobs that they want. And so if that's just a certification, great. If it's a 2-year degree, great. Or if it's a 4-year degree, great. So matching sort of more students' interests and desires with the workforce needs, but not necessarily that requiring a 4-year degree. Does that make sense to you?
It totally does. And that's an even better segue into talking about higher ed, because it reveals, I think, that the structural challenges facing traditional 4-year higher ed institutions run deeper than just, the demographic cliff, right? If people have, birth rates have been declining, and that's baked in, right? Today's 18. Even if birth rates went back up,
you just had the state demographer do
right. Yeah, even if birth rates went back up tomorrow, 20 years before that shows up in our enrollment. So that's number one. The enrollment cliff is hit colleges nationally earlier than we expected because men have declined in their college attendance rate in the last 8 years or so, I think. And then, of course, the third pillar in our woes, our enrollment woes, is trust. There was a new Gallup poll that just came out that found that trust in universities, driven especially by Republicans and independents, but even Democrats a little bit also, has hit a new low. And the thing that was new this time, the surveys that I've seen kind of all have the top 3 reasons being they cost too much, they're not training the right skills, and they're too politicized. There's various versions of that, but basically people think they're too kind of left activist. What was interesting this time is that historically, cost and skills have been the higher of those two concerns. And this was the first time I've seen where actually politics were a bigger concern than cost. My guess is that has something to do with the news cycles around post October 7th. But did you see that poll, and kind of what's your take on the landscape we're looking at?
Well, and you can imagine we regents and the president and the chancellors, we talk about all these polls a lot.
I'm glad to hear that. Right.
Yes. It's interesting. In terms of cost, we have started doing outreach trips across the state. In fact, next week I'm going up to the Northwest to Craig and Steamboat and so forth. And we always talk to counselors from the various school districts. And the first meeting we had, we were just appalled when the counselor said, well, my child is not going to go to CU because it costs $50,000 a year. And we all...
No, it doesn't.
We all just said, what? you're a high school counselor, and that's what you're telling your students. And this is in a rural part of the state, right? So we realize we need to get that information out, because that's not true at all. That would be a private school or maybe out of state tuition, right? At another university.
It's a small fraction of that. This is just in case we have any prospective students, because I think this episode, we're recording in July, but this will air in September, right around when people start thinking about these things. Do you happen to know off the top of your head what in-state tuition is at CU Boulder for Colorado students, in case guidance counselors are listening?
Yes. I would. So it depends on the major, like which school you're in.
Sure, right. Faculty of Science, Faculty of Arts, College of Business,
I would say average would be $12,000
a year.
Per semester. I think per semester. I'm trying to think. I paid.
But still, that's even if that's right, that's less than half.
Right, but the thing is,
50, right?
Right. We have a sliding scale. So depending on your income, your family's income level,
financial aid,
you may be fully covered with between, Pell grants and then what we provide in terms of scholarships. You may end up paying nothing in terms of tuition. So there's a lot that goes into that. So one is, do people actually know the real cost for university? And the majority of our students are leaving, if they have any sort of debt, it's, $20,000 or less over a 4-year period. And, as we all know, when you get a college degree, over your lifetime, on average, you're going to make $1 million more in that lifetime, right? So depending on your major and so forth, it could be pretty quick to pay off that fairly small debt. It's not going to be a $100,000 or $200,000 debt that people think about. Okay,
so people shouldn't be as concerned as they are about cost. What about job skills and politics?
Okay, so I'll tackle politics next. Being a scientist and a science major, I always have a hard time wrapping my head around this, because an atom is an atom and 2 + 2 is 4.
Right.
And, so you don't really get into the politics when you're a science or STEM major, right? But our board is made up of Republicans and Democrats, and the Republicans believe deeply in CU and its mission, and they think that it provides a great education for any student across our state, be it rural, a city slicker, Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated. And we have 3 different general education campuses. We have Colorado Springs, Denver, and Boulder, all different, very, very, very different experiences, student body, and so forth. So it's unfortunate that this whole thing about CU is going to brainwash your students. I just don't buy that. And you may push back against me, but
not as hard as you might think. So first of all, for any conservative student or parent who's listening to this, I encourage you to go back to one of the first episodes I ever aired with Joey Fertino, who formerly was the president of the CU College Republicans.
And I got to know him in the polarizing.
And you got to know him through the polarization dialogues. And the whole point of that episode was to get a firsthand take of, where's the there, and where isn't there, right? And some of the things he said that I think are very important, that support the point that you just made are, he had a great experience and, would do it over again. His choice of major, although it's possible it was indirectly related to his politics, right? Maybe his interest in business influenced his choice to be a Republican and his choice to go into business, but he didn't kind of consciously choose to go into business because he was a Republican and thought that would be a safe place to be a Republican. He just wanted to go into business. He had a good time. He did perceive a liberal skew in the demographics of our faculty, which is an empirical fact nationally, right? That there is a large liberal skew. He did say that a non-trivial fraction of his professors, he felt, although not in business, in some of his electives, he felt, did have a stake in what worldview is being presented. But to your larger point, he did not feel, and other survey studies nationally support this, he did not feel that even if there were any attempts at indoctrination, that there was much success. that people, if conservatives are concerned about liberal indoctrination in education, probably K-12 is where the action is, in terms of, when students are more impressionable, more open to suggestion by their teachers. And I think we could do a whole episode on this, but I think you could make a strong case nationally that schools of education, are particularly skewed. I was just recording an episode with somebody else where we're talking about, what would liberals do if they found out that the most widely cited education textbooks were written by literal Nazi sympathizers whose most famous ideas were directly connected to their literal Nazi sympathizing. We'd be upset about that. Replace Nazism and communism, and that's basically the reality, right? With people like Paulo Freire, for example, Pedagogy of the Oppressed literally praises Mao, deadliest dictator in history. I think the most cited used assigned textbook in schools of ed. So I guess the point of all that being particularly at a flagship school, the students, the faculty, and the faculty may be skewed to the left, although in fields that are not politically charged to begin with, that may not be perceptible, right? Like you said, an atom's an atom, right? A bridge is a bridge.
And I know certainly when I went to school, which was quite a long time ago, I had no idea what party any of my professors were, and it was never talked about. But times have changed.
And I suspect that may be related to the fact that the most politically balanced, there's no fields that are politically balanced, I think, except military history, which doesn't even exist in most schools. But the most politically balanced fields are, I think, math, engineering, and economics. And my guess in the case of math and engineering is that your politics, nobody knows what your politics are, right? so it's not relevant. And then in economics, there is certainly although it still is, I think, a 3 or 4 to 1 liberal to conservative ratio among faculty, there is more of a conservative political influence in the history of the field than in, say, ethnic studies, where there isn't one.
Well, and I'll just say, it's interesting. So an outreach trip that we took actually 3 years ago, because I came back and got COVID. We were on the Western Slope, and we met with the chamber, and they had a student sit in with us, and he was graduating and coming to CU, Boulder. And I thought, wow, because this kid looked like a farm kid, right? And I thought, oh, that's just interesting, So I wonder why he chose Boulder. And he came right up to me afterwards because I said, oh, I'm at Boulder. I would love to meet with you. And so he took me up on that. And so we met, I think probably 2 years ago. And I asked him, I said, how was your experience, coming from the Western Slope and coming to Boulder, much bigger city and so forth. And he said, oh my gosh, this has just been the most fantastic experience. My roommate is from Cleveland, I'm with all sorts of different people. We want to start a business, and it was some sort of like athletic clothing line for men. And he was just so happy to be at Boulder. And I was so happy to see that he was having such a positive experience coming from, what you would term more red Western
conservative part of the state. Yeah. Let me ask you this. Do you think that flagship schools have a natural advantage in coming out of this polarized moment? And I think, for example, compare it to Harvard and Penn, schools like that have a very low admit rate, enormously skewed to kids from privileged families, and to varying degrees in recent years have asked admission questions that either directly or indirectly probably have selected for progressive activism. And, so there's a famous case of the kid who got into Stanford with an essay where he wrote, hashtag Black Lives Matter 100 times, right? Stuff like that. Literally. And if you look at the political demographics of undergraduates, there's national surveys on this. The most representative of the country are actually flagships in red states. I think University of Arkansas has a student body that basically looks like the country. politically. But other kind of flagships, are not so far off, again, because you're drawing a large sample of the state. And, most states, even what we think of as like a blue state or a red state, is rarely bluer or redder than 60-40, right? in terms of the electoral outcome. But not so at some of these very selective, New England and West Coast schools. And those tend to be the ones where you saw the most divisive protests following October 7th. The ones where people were in the streets chanting "Death to America." People are holding signs saying, basically the terrorists who perpetrated October 7th should target these people next, pointing at Jewish students. Just kind of pretty icky scenes like that. Again, regardless of what you think about the Israel-Palestine conflict in this particular iteration of it, those scenes were pretty rare at major flagships. I mean, for example, Boulder. I think I tweeted about this because I was so impressed by it. It was better than nothing. There was one day where there was about roughly 100, in my estimation, pro-Palestinian protesters, and about 50 yards away or 30 yards away, there's about 50 pro-Israel protesters. And the pro-Palestine protesters were peacefully talking to people who walked by, and the pro-Israel protesters were singing, and the campus's head of issues management and somebody from campus police were just kind of standing in the side watching, not intervening. It's like, that's free speech. That's the way it should be. So yeah, do you think that flagship schools have an advantage? And do you think we have a responsibility to figure this out?
Well, it's interesting because the Boulder campus is the flagship campus. However, so I went to UC Santa Barbara, and I knew one person from out of state my whole 4 years. That's not the case for Boulder, right?
Right. It's like 45% or something.
I don't think it's quite that high, but we have really a significant percentage of out of state students. So it's maybe not such a great reflection of sort of our state's population, or at least high schoolers, right?
Right.
I think in the case of Boulder, though, the leadership matters. So we have had very controversial speakers come, like Yiannopoulos, or however you pronounce his name.
Milo Yiannopoulos, yeah.
Where, at Berkeley, they actually had a shooting there, right? And so what the campus leadership did was, we're not going to block him from coming. We believe in free speech. But we are going to have an alternative event, and most of the students went there. And then some were outside protesting, but it was all very calm, sort of like what happened at the UMC. And that is the Dalton Trumbo fountain, right? Which there's a whole history behind that, which is sort of an interesting place to gather, right? So I think leadership can make a difference, and it percolates then through the student body. And as you said, at Boulder, they were quite respectful of each group, right?
Yeah, I mean, even more recently, we had Yoram Hazony speak. He gave a talk called "The Case for Israeli Nationalism." You can imagine that would be controversial, right?
Right.
Today's, post October 7th campus. And there were protesters, but they were, the ones that were disruptive were quickly removed, and the ones that were not disruptive were able to, stay afterwards and ask good questions and have a robust discussion. Similar with Christopher Rufo when he was here.
Right. So I think in that standpoint, Boulder's had a long history of having controversial speakers. As a Regent, we'll sometimes get emails regarding that, but we say we honor freedom of speech. And if a student group wants to bring in a speaker that might be controversial, so be it. And I think that's just a great example to just provide another avenue where students may say, I'd rather do this. And then it ends up not being messy like a Berkeley.
So let me first praise CU and the Regents in particular, and then push you a little bit. So I think not enough people know this, but we have a very strong free expression policy that, last time I checked, we were one of 55 campuses in the country that had a green light rating, the highest free speech rating from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. I think there have been some policy changes, and there's maybe a few more than 55 now, but it still is a good thing that is relatively rare. We also have political non-discrimination in our discrimination policy, which I think is, again, relatively unknown and relatively unusual. You can't discriminate in terms, at least according to our policy, in hiring and, grading and anything else on the basis of political affiliation and political philosophy, and so those are kind of rare policies. And we have, like you said, we have a very strong practice, not just policy, of allowing, and I would say facilitating, controversial speakers, right? It's not just like, oh yeah, your speaker can come, but they can also disrupt. That's free speech. It's like, no, we have, time and place.
Yes.
So a lot of people who are for reform, right? There's kind of ranging from, moderates like me to people who are conservative. A lot of the policies that they would push for, the three policies that pretty much most of us agree on, are free expression, which CU has, institutional neutrality, which as far as I know, CU doesn't have, but maybe considered at one point. And then with all based in Chicago, the Shills Report is the third one, which we sort of have. The Shills Report is about, basically we don't hire based on politics or ethnicity or gender or anything else. We just hire, based on scholarly qualifications. Do you think that and again, that, as a matter of policy, we sort of have that one. Do you think that universities should adopt those policies?
Free expression, certainly. The institutional neutrality, that's interesting because I see that that's being brought up now, especially from those schools where the presidents had to go and testify
say something,
in Congress and they're not around any longer. And then the Shill Report, I was not aware of that one. So
that's also Chicago. It's called the Chicago trifecta, all three of these policies.
So that it seems like the Supreme Court is taking care of that issue, right?
No, this is actually a common misconception about the law. So discrimination in admissions is what was, or affirmative action in admissions was what the Supreme Court struck down. Discrimination in hiring was never allowed as a matter of law, except in federal contracting could prioritize, I think, under the all the affirmative action policies. There's some gray area in federal law where you have the disparate impact doctrine of the civil right, that's been in the jurisprudence of the Civil Rights Act that basically says if you can show evidence of disparate impact even without disparate treatment, then you might have a problem. And some workplaces have interpreted that to mean that if your demographics of your workforce is different in some way, substantial way from the demographics of your applicant pool, then that implies disparate impact that needs to be remedied. Sorry, the other exception to in hiring discrimination in federal law is if it's remedying a specific past discrimination, then it's okay. But again, that's not like applied, that the law doesn't allow that to be applied in a cosmic way, right? So you can't say, 50 years ago, society discriminated, therefore we, this company, are going to discriminate. It's if we, this company, know that we discriminated, 10 years ago, then it's okay to discriminate, to correct that. But there is this gray area with disparate, it's never okay to discriminate, but then also disparate impact. And sometimes those two can come into conflict with each other. And then there are several states, including, for example, Michigan and California, and I believe Washington, that have explicitly through ballot measure said, you can never discriminate. So I guess what I'm saying is that the Supreme Court decision has not changed the law. I think that many legal experts I've read would argue that many of the practices that go on in universities in terms of hiring have long violated the law. But the reason I think it hasn't come to a head is that it's very hard for the courts to deal with. So I wrote a Chronicle of Higher Education article recently that talked about this, and to have a court case, you need to have a plaintiff. And many universities' discrimination policies, including ours, require a plaintiff too. So what happens if you have a job, somebody says, I'm creating a faculty line and I'm going to hire this specific person because they're this specific demographic. In order for the court to stop that, you need to have somebody who didn't know they couldn't apply for a job that was never posted and was willing to risk their career suing over it. And even if they did, they might still lose. So there have been two cases, one at Santa Cruz and one at Texas A&M. Somebody sued over this type of thing. In one case, it was the demographic discrimination. In one case, it was DEI statements. And in both cases, the court said, you might have a point about discrimination, but you don't have standing to sue because you can't prove you actually were going to apply for this job. So,
yeah.
So I guess the point is that
I was thinking of the Supreme Court in terms of students that we admit.
Oh, sure. Yeah. But flagship schools tend to have such high admit rates, unless you're Berkeley or UNC or something, that it almost doesn't matter kind of whether you like affirmative action or not. Right. I remember, post George Floyd, a lot of people I know were looking into the data, how can CU be more diverse? Right. And it seemed like applications was sort of where the action was for the undergrads, right? You're not going to, even if you were allowed to, you're not going to make a huge difference, by turning the knob, because it's just not a very big knob in the way that it is at Harvard.
Yeah. So, the question of institutional neutrality, I think, is an interesting one. And you would know better than me, because obviously this is not my area of expertise. But when this came up, and I assume this is a policy that their board of trustees voted for, I would be curious, has Chicago stuck with it?
That's a great question. My sense, I don't completely know the answer. I'm sure that you could find instances where they didn't, but my perception is that they have stuck to it far more closely than anybody else almost. And to be fair, because they're one of the only ones until recently that had it.
Right. Because I'm curious what other universities signed on to this policy, and
several recently, I believe.
Have they stuck with it?
I believe Harvard, several in the last year. So Harvard.
That was because of what happened on October 7th, and then which of course conservatives are maybe understandably raising eyebrows about, right? We didn't want to be neutral until we had to condemn Hamas, right? That's not a good look. No. So, if you're going to be neutral, you got to be neutral on everything, right?
Yeah.
You can't pick and choose. So, it's an interesting concept. I don't know. I would need more information about it to really.
Yeah, no, that's fair. You're a sitting Regent. I don't want to, pin you on the spot for a policy stance. One of the things
I'm only here, how many more months? 6 more months, and it takes quite a long time to get a new policy through.
Yeah,
so it's not going to happen on my watch.
I mean, I think one of the reasons, the less cynical view of why presidents have started adopting institutional neutrality is they realize that once you're expected to make statements about current events, kind of when does it stop, right? And what does it really do? Does anybody? I remember when we had a controversy about a sabbatical visitor who wrote an op-ed about Kamala Harris's eligibility to be president, a few years ago, and I remember seeing a message from our dean at the time saying that he disagreed with what he was saying, but he had the right to say it. And I'm just like, does anybody care what a chemist thinks about law? They think about the same kind of thing for other presidents. One of the things that I'm going to be helping with the president with at the University of Wyoming is that they've just adopted an institutional neutrality, and we're going to have rapid response dialogues. So the way I pitched it to him was, anytime something happens in the world that people are pressuring you to make a statement about, instead, we'll have a faculty panel of, the most relevant expert faculty representing different perspectives. And then we'll have our Bridge USA chapter facilitate a student dialogue about the issue.
That sounds interesting.
And so it's the university can engage on the issues as they come up, but they don't have to engage in a way, where we
say yes or no.
Or we pretend that we know or care what the president thinks about every issue, right?
Well, and, I will say that, again, as regents, we get a lot of emails when something controversial comes up, right? And we have a lot of discussions. We hardly ever make a statement because, again, we have Republicans and Democrats. We may not see eye to eye on a controversial issue. And it's really hard because we all have to agree to a statement. And so more often than not, we don't ever have a statement from the regions.
Yeah, no, right. That's well, and that in a sense is one of the ethical arguments that people make in favor of institutional neutrality. It's that, if we want to have a culture of academic freedom beyond just a policy of academic freedom, it has a chilling effect if the president and the chancellor and whoever else are signaling that they have a particular stance, and it's always kind of a stance on one side, right? So how many schools had several statements decrying the decision about affirmative action, the Supreme Court decision, which is among the public is a 2-to-1 majority support for that decision, and then how slow are people to make decisions or to issue statements about the attack on Israel even before there was retaliation. Well, let's go to a brighter topic. One of the things that strikes me in national politics generally, not just higher ed, is that there's a lot more agreement on things than people think, right? If you had to, and a student of mine and I did this 4 years ago, if you had to make a platform of policies that had 2/3 majority support, you could do a heck of a lot, right? You raise the minimum wage, build more infrastructure, give permanent status to the Dreamers, the DACA recipients, but also have more border security. You could still have a Second Amendment, but you could also have universal background checks, right? And so just something that just seems like the talking heads are way more divided than the public is. Is there anywhere, either in Colorado politics or higher ed or both, where you see that phenomenon, where there's just like something that needs to be done and there's just a huge appetite among voters on both sides to roll up their sleeves and do it?
Yeah, well, I first of all, I got to know Renee through the series, and I love that study. And it would be wonderful if somehow politicians could realize that there are a lot of issues that the majority of the public agree with, and spend your time on that, please. But, they need their sound bites of why they're different, right? And beat up on each other so that they would get elected or get, more money through fundraising. So my district is actually really large. It's very western Boulder, all the way up to the Continental Divide. It's western Larimer, which is north of us, up to Wyoming, to the Continental Divide, and then Clear Creek and Gilpin, which are at the Continental Divide. So it's large, and it's mainly mountain rural. And I've spent a year and a half traveling around, and then also doing CU outreach. And really, the number one issue is the cost of housing. So that is something where I would say across, what's the proper way to attack this? There's going to be different opinions on that, but that is definitely a topic that crosses political boundaries, urban, suburban, rural, et cetera. And I would say it's not only just in this state, right?
Totally. I mean, in fact, it's as bad as cost of living is in the U.S., it's much worse in Canada statistically, and has become the single dominant national election issue in Canada right now. And like you said, there's interesting, it cuts across Democrat, Republican, it cuts across class, right? There's high cost of housing, there's high cost of buying, there's also usually high cost of renting, there's speculation, there's gentrification, and some of the ideas, building more supply is one of the oft proposed solutions to that. And that often has both conservative and liberal flavors of it, right? Mixed do maybe is somewhat of a liberal flavor, but also cutting red tape, making it easier to build is kind of a conservative flavor. Do you think that do you find there's a constructive appetite among Colorado politicians in general to work on that issue? Is that issue kind of risen to the fore statewide at this point?
Well, definitely not this last session, but the session before, the governor tried to get Senate Bill 213, which, was sort of using a big hammer saying, you must do this in terms of increasing housing stock, and that flopped on its face. So that required getting out, having elected officials going out and talking to city council, county commissioners, et cetera. And so they chunked it up into smaller bites. And so this past session, several bills passed, which not everyone was happy with, but I think it could really move the needle on the housing stock. And it's so different. We went up to Summit County, and we think housing is expensive in Boulder, the average housing cost, but in Summit County, because it's a ski industry.
Oh yeah.
It's millions of dollars for the average house. And then
just for our listeners who don't know, Summit County is Aspen and Vail and Breckenridge, or a subset of those?
Just Vail. Breckenridge. Yeah, Aspen, that's
all the big ski towns besides Aspen.
Exactly. Yeah. So, which is different than Boulder, which is different than Grand Junction. So, I'm quickly realizing that housing is an issue across the state, but the solutions to tackle it are going to be very different and very specific to each community. And I think that's what people need to realize and understand when they're trying to put policies together. It's just not going to work, one size fits all.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So just one last question to wrap up. If, when you look back on what we hope and suspect will be your first term in office, what is one thing that you hope to have accomplished?
The main reason why I'm running is water, climate change, and the environment. And I really do see a need that we are going to have to move to not just our state, but our country, our world, to a clean energy economy. I do realize that communities do, their economies are driven by the fossil fuel industry. I met with the pipe fitters. They have good unionized jobs. They're worried about losing those jobs. So I am very understanding of that too. So I think we need to come up with a very, a good, clear plan. Can't do it, switch on a light or turn off the light switch. It's going to have to be well thought out with the economic impacts taken into mind. And so if I could start moving the needle on that, I feel like that would be a big accomplishment.
Yeah, and it would take a whole nother podcast to go into the reasons for this, but I would say if any state can figure out how to do this, Colorado would be near the top, if not at the top of my list, because I think that there's an appetite, a very large appetite from a number of different sides to do something, but also, like you said, to do something that pays attention to the details, that pays attention to making sure that people aren't left behind, and that makes it an opportunity as opposed to a cost to the economy of Colorado.
Yes.
Well, that's a very optimistic note to end on.
Well,
Lesley Smith.
I'm an optimist, so there's my optimistic view.
I think of myself as a cynical optimist, which only makes sense half the time.
As academics, we question, right?
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Thank you. You get it. Well, Lesley Smith, thanks you so much for being on the Free Mind podcast. Thank you for all your support of our polarization work that we've done over the years. And best of luck in your future in politics. And I'm excited to see where it goes.
Well, thank you, Matt. And best of luck to you. I've really enjoyed working with you all these years. I'm sorry to see you go, but I'm excited for your next step. And I'm sure you're going to do great things for Wyoming.
Same to you. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Okay.
The Free Mind podcast is produced by the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado Boulder. You can email us feedback at freemind@colorado.edu or visit us online at colorado.edu/center/Benson. You can also find us on social media Our Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube accounts are all at Benson Center. Our Instagram is at The Benson Center, and the Facebook is at Bruce D. Benson Center.